moved it forward.
Good afternoon. I think we should probably start with an apology that some of you were expecting to hear us talk about Leonardo da Vinci. As you know, that we may know, that has unfortunately been cancelled. The visually acute among you will realize that this is not Luke Sisson, but is in fact Navina Haidar, who is responsible for the most beautiful presentation of the new Islamic galleries at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I'm Neil McGregor, I used to work at the British Museum, and we're going to talk about portraiture in the Islamic and the Indian tradition, as opposed to the Western European tradition, and the different ways of thinking about the face. And we thought we would start with a particular kind of portrait. You all know what a portrait is. You all know what you think you expect of a portrait, that it's what somebody looks like. Do you want to, should we move on to the first one?
Yeah, we might have to look at that.
Sorry?
Okay.
Yes.
So we
yes.
might.
There is, and so we're starting with, we're talking about different kinds of portraits in this session. We thought we would start with the observed portrait, the portrait that what most of us understand, a likeness of a particular person. And the interesting thing is that this is really quite a late development as far as we can tell. And it's something that the Romans establish in the most extraordinary way. This portrait bust is, I think, a perfect example of an observed portrait. Nobody, I think, would regard this man as being particularly good looking. I don't think it would matter which side you were looking at him from. He's not beautiful, and he's not been presented as beautiful. And it takes us right into the heart of the question. If you're presenting a human face, what are you doing? Are you drawing what you see in front of you, or are you making a statement about the person and what they want to be? This, I think, is a wonderful demonstration of somebody clearly as they are. It's a private portrait in that sense. This is the man that you knew. He's podgy, looks as though his lower teeth have mostly disappeared, and he's a straightforward, not good-looking man. It's a proper, observed portrait. And are there equivalents, Navina, in the Islamic tradition?
Yes.
In the other traditions?
Yes. Well, this, the idea of being very faithful. Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, there we are. The idea of being very faithful to the formal appearance of somebody. Can you hear me? No. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good. The idea of faithfully representing somebody's likeness as an image and a portrait based on observation was something that we see coming to a great moment in the Mughal period in India. And in fact, it's the first time, in some sense, within the Indic and the Islamic tradition that you have that kind of commitment to observation. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. So I have here two portraits on the screen which show you works of art, two small paintings from the period of Akbar, the Mughal emperor who ruled in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And he was the innovator of many things in the arts, but it was his command, his royal command, to actually capture the exact likeness of his courtiers, and that gave rise to a whole new development in Indian and Islamic art, where for the first time we begin to see faithful representations. And you have on the screen two important courtiers from the period of Akbar. One is Man Singh, who actually ruled in this area. We're very much in the world of Raja Man Singh here in Jaipur. And beside him, the dark-skinned figure is Tansen, the great composer of music from the Mughal period. But perhaps the most famous portrait of the Mughal period is the portrait that you see, the haunting portrait of a man lying on his bed 3 days before his death, as captured by Jahangir's court portrait. Now, the same man is shown in a smaller image, younger, healthier, before he fell into terrible opium addiction. And the fact that you can see his life go before your eyes from health and virility and strength to a wasted away form, which is captured and described in the emperor's memoirs, is a fascinating aspect of the commitment to observation, faithful observation, and recording a man from health to death.
I think one of the interesting questions that this raises is here you have a very public figure shown weak. Who is this image for? Because one of the key points of portraiture is always to ask, why is the portrait being made? Who is meant to be looking at it? And for the Roman bust, it's clearly for friends, it's a family memorial that you're meant to recognize. Who is meant to look at this? And what are you meant to understand from it? Mm-hmm.
Well, in the case of this specific context, these are from royal albums that were made only for very small audiences, the emperor and the royal court. But to quote John Berger, the great art historian who's just passed away, he reminds us about the utter transformation in our understanding of art with the introduction of reproductive images, where a private image now goes into the public sphere. So the question about who the image is for is an ever-evolving one, and we find that in our times it's for more people than it was in its original moment.
It's also, I think, one of the great differences between obviously the Mediterranean, the European world, and the Islamic world. The idea of the public portrait, of course, is very much based on a Roman tradition of the great statues of the emperor. The public portrait, which then doesn't happen again in the Islamic world. So that particular tradition stops, and the representations become private in this way. The ultimate private portrait is, of course, the self-portrait. And this, I think, may be, I don't know what Navina thinks, one of the really interesting divides between the European tradition and the Islamic and the Indian one. This, of course, is the famous Rembrandt self-portrait in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I think you can see that it's in exactly the same tradition as that Roman portrait bust. Rembrandt shows himself very much the worse for wear. He's about 60 when he paints this. His nose is not a thing of great public beauty. And the whole of his face shows that this is a man who has lived very hard. He has money difficulties, not because he's not appreciated, but just because he spends too much money. He's a man who's made a complete mess of his life. He's behaved very badly, everybody knows he's behaved badly, and he's a great painter. And he paints himself. And it's not at all clear who these are painted for. The great series of Rembrandt self-portraits raises that question: why does an artist go on painting a portrait? What are you doing? And we think that he kept these in his studio so that people could see what he could do. But it's clear that he's also looking at himself. He's using the portrait, the self-portrait, as a kind of self-interrogation, self-investigation. Nobody would regard him as a handsome man, but none of us, I think, can look at this without being moved at the ability to look at yourself so clearly. And I want to ask you, Navina, whether you would agree that this is one of the great divisions between the European tradition and the Islamic Indian one, the self-portrait as self-examination.
Yes, very much so, I would agree. I think the anonymity of non-Western artists stands in stark contrast to the record of known artists in the Western tradition. And in fact, the rise and the recognition of the individual artist is married to the idea of the individual in society as a whole. And so it's really a concept and an identity in society that is related to broader trends and not just restricted to the world of the artist. You do have, on rare occasions, images or self-images of artists within the Mughal and Persian painting tradition, but these are usually very humble little images that are contained within the hashiyas or the borders of an album painting, or tucked away as one of the many courtiers that are portrayed in a court. The idea of actually looking deeply into yourself as an artist, or even recording another artist, you know, doesn't marry well with the hierarchical aspects of court life, and also the sense of the individual and his place in society and in the court.
I think something, I don't know whether what you feel, whether this really is a kind of narcissism. I mean, what is going on when you go on painting yourself? Are you really so interesting? Who's going to be interested in it? And what are you saying? And I think, as you say, that notion of the individual being more important than him in his public role. You wouldn't know he was a painter. Nothing tells you what he does. He just is.
That's right. Now, one of the things that's also very fascinating is the idea of the human mind and psyche, and what you can read into the nature of a person, including your own nature, through your image. And the ideas and the perception of the mind and the personality and so on are also at some point to be interwoven in our understanding of images, especially self-images.
Can I just say on that, before we leave this, I think this is one of the most interesting things. Can you tell from a face what's going on? One of the great insights, I think, about Rembrandt's Portraiture by Ernst Gombrich, the great art historian, was that when we look at a face, the bits of the face that you look at most intently are the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth, because that tells you what kind of mood the person opposite you is in, whether they're smiley, whether they're dangerous, whether they're feeling angry, whatever. It's those bits of the face that tell you what's going on, and we are attuned to look there. What Rembrandt does quite deliberately is put those bits into shadow, so that you can't read them. You have to keep going back, trying to work out what is going on. And we do that quite unconsciously. We want to know what is happening to the corners of the mouth, especially, because that's when you know whether you've got a friend or how you're going to react. So that idea of a personality behind the face is a very central one in this tradition.
Well, we can take a quantum leap now into more recent times, because I think the rise of the photographic portrait opens up a whole new chapter in our thinking about how faithful to be to the appearance of a person, and how you can move beyond that, because now recording the facial features of a person with a camera is no longer a problem. You don't have to have the technical skill and the training that you might have had to have as a sculptor or a painter, but you have this extraordinary instrument known as the camera, by which you can capture somebody's likeness. So what are you going to do with it now that you have it? That's the big question with photography, one of the questions. And here you have a portrait of James Joyce, the author, during the writing of one of his texts when he developed a terrible eye infection, and you see him wearing a heavy black patch over his eye in this image. But I wonder what you feel about the rise of photography as a kind of parallel development in portraiture, in formal portraiture.
Well, I think what it does, obviously, is it allows far more people to have portraits. You have sudden democratization of the portrait. You don't need to be rich, you don't need a painter. But above all, and I think you can see it here, it lets you stage yourself. You can be the person you want to be. Even though you look as you do, you can present yourself as James Joyce does here. And choose to be photographed with the black patch is, of course, a wonderful statement that he's quite rough, quite wild, the pirate with the black eye patch, but also the thinking pirate, that pose of pondering, and also, because of the shirt and the bow tie, the smart thinking pirate. All these things every one of us can now do. You can make up the persona you want to have, and you just need someone to click it. And it's one of the great developments in photography, that you put yourself on stage and you can be the person you dream of being in a way that was never possible before.
So we've been able to delve a little bit into the idea of the true portrait, or the portrait based on observation or precise likeness of a human being. I think we now plan to go into discussing the idealized portrait, which is a different concept. It's not so much as about how you do look, but it's really to do with the idea of how you should look. And that's another way of depicting the human face.
Can we go back one?
Oh, sorry.
No, to the Augustus.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I think, a good place to start a completely different kind of portrait. If you think back to that portrait head of the Roman, the puffy, toothless, unglamorous individual Roman, this is the Emperor Augustus. And the Emperor Augustus wants to look as the Emperor Augustus wants you to imagine him. So he's always presented as a young man, not a line on the face, perfectly balanced features, totally serene. This is not a man who's been marked by life, shaped by life. Nothing has affected him. And all through his reign, which is a long one, even in his 50s and 60s, he goes on being shown with that boyish hair, parted like that at the front. He remains the young man, with a full young man's head of hair and the completely unmoved, serene face. And very critically, and this is something we'll come to again, one of the interesting questions in a portrait is this person looking at you? You are looking at them, but are they looking at you? And of course, if you're the emperor, you certainly are not going to be bothered looking at the likes of you. That's not the point of the that's not the point of the portrait. So Augustus is either shown with blank eyes or eyes that look right over your head. This is a one-way portrait. It's a portrait for you to look at him, while he remains serene, floating in another world. In every way, you're superior.
So on the concept of the idealized figure, or the ruler, or the hero king, you have many examples in the Islamic world. In fact, of all forms of representation, human representation, the idea of an idealized image was the most palatable to the Muslim world because of a perceived, because Islam is an aniconic religion. There is no image that is associated with the idea of God, and by extension and by tradition, there is a somewhat subdued tradition of figural representation. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it exists within certain normative constraints. And therefore, the concept of an idealized figure, rather than a literal representation of someone, was much more developed in the Islamic world than perhaps elsewhere. Now, to some extent, the Muslim traditions inherited a lot of these traditions, and in the pictures that you have up here, you have two images of the Persian hero king Behram Gur, who occurs in pre-Islamic Persian literature and also in the literature of the Islamic period in Iran. And you see him in a plate from the Sasanian period closer to me, where you can recognize him. He's on the back of a camel, and he has his consort Azadeh. It's a bit of a gruesome story where he tries to impress her by shooting together, pinning together the ear and the hoof of an onager, which is a type of deer. And when she objected to his actions, he had her thrown underground and trampled underfoot. So you can recognize her being trampled underfoot in that second painting, the second one, and just less of the story in the first. But essentially, one of these comes from the pre-Islamic period in Iran, and the other comes from the 13th century when Islam had very much lodged itself in Iran, established itself in Iran. The figure, the hero king, has survived this transition. He looks slightly different in Islamic times, because by the 13th century, the ideal forms that had come into Iran were very much influenced by East Asian models. So they look basically more Chinese in their appearance. But the essential figure is the same, and he is idealized in both cases. He looks one way in one culture, one way in another culture, but he is in both instances a kind of idealized representation of an epic figure. We could move on.
The tradition goes on, and I think it's interesting to think about today. How does a ruler show that they're a ruler? What is the proper image of the victorious ruler? Well, you all know perfectly well, it's Vladimir Putin on horseback. That's what a ruler is. And there's a very old tradition. And Van Dyck, Charles I, is exactly the same as Vladimir Putin on horseback. I didn't show you Vladimir Putin because you know what he looks like, and it would only distress us all to have to see it again. But he shows himself naked from the waist up, the tough fighter. Charles shows himself in armor. They're both very little men. Both Vladimir Putin and Charles I of England were little, but you would never guess that, of course, from the image. They both appear on horseback because, of course, it makes you look like the man of action, the champion we saw before from the Islamic world. The man on horse is the man who knows how to rule you. He can control the animal instincts of the horse, and he's above you physically. And exactly the same in this portrait. Very, very interesting games about where you stand. This is life size of a horse. That means that when you are standing looking at it, your eye level is the stirrup and the foot. You are at the foot of your sovereign, just where you belong. But very interesting, and again, you see this in photographs of Putin. When you look up at the face of your king, you don't look up and look up his nostrils, because that would be very, very disrespectful, and we're not sure a king actually has proper nostrils, because he's a higher order of being. So the face is presented without any perspective at all. The face floats in a different world. It's a classic way of manipulating you, the viewer, to feel that this man operates in different worlds. He's not even subject to the laws of perspective. And you can only feel very glad that this man, a tough fighter on a horse, is in control of you. This is a very, very clever kind of portrait. And I don't know whether I think we're all waiting to see in Washington what kind of official portrait we're going to have of the new ruler there and how he's going to appear, because the portrait will be very, very important. And we've all seen the portraits to date, just photographs of him performing. There has to be at some point a stylized image of the ruler that we're all very grateful to have as the ruler, the superior being to whom we will defer. It'll be interesting to see whether any artist can actually pull that off. But that's a challenge for the future.
Moving away from the realm of kings and heroes, we also have to consider the image of the ordinary person and the domestic world. Here in a portrait, in a painting from Iran from the 15th century, you have a pair of idealized lovers, because social behavior, social intercourse and so on is often quite well represented in painting, and when you can't do it literally through the interaction of two actual people, you can set down ideals of behavior, of interaction, of lovers, through images such as this. And this is quite a big, grand painting made in the 15th century, which was a time when Iran had assimilated a lot of influences from China, from Chinese art, because of the Mongol invasion of 1258, when essentially the court at Baghdad had been destroyed by the Mongol invaders. And after much turmoil in Asia, you had this great meeting, essentially, of China and Islam in the Middle East, which gave rise to extraordinary expressions in the artistic sphere. Here you have two very sweet lovers very tamely sort of holding each other at arm's length. But in fact, this was considered high erotica in its time and must have been quite scandalous. They might refer to a pair of lovers known as Hume and Humayun, who are famous lovers from Persian history or Persian mythology. Or they may just be not specific figures. But what's also wonderful about them is not just the way they hold each other and gaze into each other's arms, but in the way in which they are decorated. She has tattoos on her face, which was a form of decoration at the time. So the way you represent yourself when you meet your lover, all of this is built into a set of pictures like this, which represents an idealized set of lovers. So I think we can move on from the ideal world to the imagined world and go into the idea of the imagined portrait, which is not the same as the other two types of portraiture we've been talking about. So I'll hand over to you for Homer.
I think one of the really fascinating things about us as humans is that we want portraits. We want to know what people look like. And indeed, we need to know, because then we can engage with them. And one of the extraordinary traditions in the Mediterranean is to invent portraits of the great people who we don't know what they look like. And Homer is perhaps the best example. Somewhere around 200 BC, people decide they want images of Homer. Homer had been dead for 500 years. Nobody had the slightest idea what Homer looked like. And so somebody invents an image. And this image becomes so famous and so copied again and again that everybody across the antique world, across the Mediterranean, and right up to the 19th century would know at once who this is. It's a portrait of somebody who existed, but of whom there is no likeness. And it speaks a great deal, I think, of our need to have an image, a likeness, a portrait. And this becomes a very influential pattern all the way through.
Well, we have other meeting points. One of them in the world of the imagination is when a secular figure, somebody who really existed, takes on the attributes of somebody who is divine. And the concept of a sort of divine portrait is a very major idea that permeates many artistic cultures. And in this piece of sculpture, which is from Java in the 14th century, you have the image of a queen who is idealized as the goddess Parvati, the Hindu goddess Parvati. And you could find many, many examples of this before the separation of church and state in our minds and in our practices. There was, in fact, a desire to unify the temporal world and the mystical world, the world of the gods, and the person on whom this unification took place more often than not was the ruler, whether it was a queen or the king. And so this is a fascinating meeting point, I think, between a different sort of way of imagining a portrait.
I think it's a very interesting thing because the queen as Parvati is something that you couldn't have in a Christian tradition. Clearly, no ruler can be shown as Christ. No queen could be shown as the Virgin Mary. So it's not possible. But they find other ways of trying to suggest that they're very close to God. But this is a wonderful way of using a portrait to identify directly earthly power with religious power.
And the same, I mean, we have this extraordinary sculpture in the Metropolitan Museum, which is of a child saint from Tamil Nadu. And he's a historical figure, but again, he was never known or portrayed, literally portrayed in his own time. But in the great Chola bronze casting tradition, you have a little portrait of him, a sculpture portrait of him, showing him as a child saint. And again, it is a kind of imagined portrait of a historical figure, bringing together human and divine characteristics because he occupies the important platform of a saint.
So this is like the Homer, in a sense.
It is like the Homer, yes.
Yes.
And I think we found a meeting point between East and West in this particular sculpture because it shows the head of Dionysus made in the Gandhara period in Pakistan.
And this is, of course, one of the great crossover objects. The Greek culture that comes from the Mediterranean into the Indus Valley and beyond. And Dionysus is, again, a god that we know what he looks like in an extraordinary way, this god that never existed. And the really fascinating thing is Dionysus, as you know, is the god of wine. Normally, you know that you're looking at an image of the god of wine, either because he's got grapes in his hair, which is a clue, or because he's riding on a donkey that he's just fallen off because he's drunk, or he's being held up because he can't stand because of wine. So you've usually got a clue, but over time, we get to know what he looks like. And this is his face. And even without any other clues, there's nothing else. We just know this is what the god looks like.
Yes,
I
think
both Asia and in Europe.
Yes, I think that's very interesting because you don't have the aid of any iconographic clues. At this point, the image has simplified to just his portrait, his imagined portrait.
And he is, of course, a god everybody wants to get close to. And he's a particularly human kind of god. So you want to know what he looks like. And you want to feel that he's a sort of chum that you might go out for a drink with, or whatever.
So now we actually are going to discuss another type of portrait, which is the religious portrait. And this is a very interesting set of images or set of ideas that evolve in relationship to religious figures. And I think we could start by looking at the case in Christianity.
One of the really fascinating things about the Christian pictorial tradition is that there is a pictorial tradition in Christianity at all. Christianity, as you know, comes completely out of the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition, like the Islamic, has no images at all. And so for the first 300 years of Christianity, there is no image of Christ at all. All that you have is what you see on the left hand of the screen, which are the Greek letters Ch and R, the first letters of Christos, of Christ. You show Christ by the letters of his name. Just as you call God Yahweh in Jewish, you never attempt to represent him. And that remains the case, that the image of Jesus are letters, a name, until Christianity becomes the religion of the empire. And what Romans are used to seeing their gods in the marketplace. They have statues, they see their God. And the Romans who become Christians wanted to see their God. Now that's a problem. Christ has been dead for 300-400 years. Nobody had told any record of what he looked like. And yet you all know what Christ looks like. Why do you know that? You know it because if there is no historical evidence, what do? You forge the historical evidence. And so there's a letter forged from a Roman in Palestine to Pontius Pilate, saying that he's just seen this man called Jesus, and he has a long, thin face, he has long brown hair, and he has a short brown beard. And out of that description comes the image of Jesus that has been with us ever since. It's a totally imaginary image based on a forged document. But it's so powerful because people want to see this God-made man. They want to be able to relate to the God-made man. That everywhere in the Western world, this kind of image, this is Dürer's portrait, this kind of image is immediately recognizable. And that, I think, is a very, very interesting thing, because it speaks of the difficulty where you have a tradition that doesn't allow images. And it's why regularly in the Christian tradition, people smash the images of Christ particularly They don't want to see an image because that makes him particular. The difficulty about this image is that you can see he's a European Christ. And the difficulty about any specific image is that it has to be a particular person, a particular kind, but we want it. It's against everything that's historically based in the religion, but it's become absolutely central. And there's a parallel, I think, in the Asian tradition.
Yes, very much so. We have the, similar to what you just showed, the migration of a set of symbols into a visual, physical form, a human-based form, also takes place in the case of Buddhism. Because early Buddhism, as many of us know, was also aniconic. There was no specific deity that represented Buddha himself. Even the pantheon of figures around him are not represented, certainly not as focuses of worship. And the earliest representations of divinity or of Buddha himself was in the form of stupas or reliquary shrines, and completely free, as you can see in the rock-cut cave closer to me, free of any humanoid form. It was a later development, specifically with the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, that the human form became attached to the idea of Buddha, and Buddha himself became imaged quite frequently. Now, of course, they had a problem also there as to what kind of image to come up with. And one of the ways that was tackled was to try and give a physical representation to all of the divine qualities of the Buddha. So what is, for example, often seen as a hairstyle, the protrusion in the above on the top of the head, is actually meant to be his extra brain, actually, which looks like it's a hairstyle, but in fact it's a sort of whole extra section that was developed as a stylistic solution to showing how to magnify the qualities of his mind. And similarly, there are other attributes on his physical form that mirror his divine or his sacred attributes. So this takes place, and once the figural tradition is established in Buddhism, it's almost inseparable in our minds from Buddhism itself. And it's very hard for us to go back to a time in Buddhism or to imagine a time when there was no image of the Buddha. I mean, for centuries now, people have looked at the image of the Buddha in meditation or the seated image of the Buddha in a cross-legged pose and felt that sense of repose, felt themselves meditate on that image. They have felt related deeply, emotionally, spiritually to that image. And so to imagine taking that away from them and taking you back to a point when there was no such figure to focus on is a very big leap back into a completely different way of thinking conceptually about the ideas that Buddhism stands for or promotes.
I think what's interesting is that everybody in the audience, I think, would know what Buddha looks like. That you have an idea, just as they would know what Christ looks like. And there's a very big question about how do you promote and propagate and disseminate and spread an image so that it becomes the one everybody recognizes. And I think when we're talking about these religious portraits, they can't happen like this and become standard without major political support. You need some kind of imperial power which will propagate the image, will control the territory, and will fund the making of the images. You need to be able to disseminate an image. And how that happens is very fascinating. And in both these cases, we know that the making of the image, the dissemination, is largely the result of an imperial secular structure, which has become, where this has become the state religion.
Now, we were going to talk, we were going to touch upon the idea of the religious image in Islam, but to approach that question, you have to think in a different way and approach it in a different way. You have up here on the screen a page from a manuscript of the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, and this page was written out sometime in the 9th or 10th century in a style known as Kufic, which is a square-based calligraphic style, one of the earliest styles in the Islamic world. And of course, as we know, as I said earlier on, Islam is an aniconic religion, and in fact the great artistic tradition in some sense of the Islamic world is the practice of calligraphy. Calligraphy quite often takes the place, in terms of prestige, occupies the highest place in the Islamic artistic sphere, and is found not just on the pages of the holy book itself, but on architecture, on objects, on textiles. It absolutely infuses the world of the Muslim from his domestic to his sacred spaces, and that is one of the great features and achievements of the Islamic tradition. But there is, in fact, a minor tradition of depicting sacred images, including rather controversially for some people, images of the Prophet Muhammad, usually in the context of epic poetry and literature, the illustration of epic poetry and literature. But the overwhelming record is one of aniconism. And as we were saying earlier, when there is such a human instinct to want an image, the fact that a whole religious tradition can consistently stay away from one for 14 centuries now shows a tremendous discipline and a tremendous adherence to a particular non-figural idea, and is probably the most enduring one, I would say, in our human history, to have survived the longest, the idea of a not caving in. And I think we can say quite confidently that there has never been, in 14 centuries of Islam, the idea of depicting God. That has never been attempted. So we're coming to a very enjoyable section now.
That was the serious part.
Yes.
We're now talking about a different kind of everyday.
Yeah. Well, one of the wonderful things about Indian art of the Mughal period is the fact that it really celebrates and concentrates not just on the human portrait, but takes very, very seriously the idea of an animal portrait as well. And we have a wonderful record of elephants and tigers, different types of exotic animals that were brought to the Mughal court, including, by the way, the only known observed portrait of a dodo bird, which went extinct in 1687, was portrayed in the period of Jahangir earlier in the 17th century. But here you have a great grand elephant whose name is Alam Guman, and he cost 1 lakh rupees at the time, and that's given to us in that inscription below his legs. And he, we know from his name, was captured in 1614 in a battle between the Mughals and the state of Mewar. He was originally an elephant that belonged to the state of Mewar and was captured at battle by the Mughals and joined the Mughal stables. And when he joined the Mughal stables, now this picture shows him in 1640, but soon after he joined the Mughal stables is one of the most delightful, oh, excuse me, I think I've lost that, yeah. This earlier picture shows him when he first came into the Mughal stables. It's a wonderful father and son portrait, father and sons, I should say, because you see Alam Guman with his own calves, his baby elephants around his legs. So the fact, again, that you can record the life of an elephant from 1618 to 1640, when he is shown as an older elephant, there he is as an older elephant, is just a wonderful commitment, really, from Mughal artists to portraiture, absolute faithful portraiture of animals.
And you might expect that when it comes to animals, this is one place where Indian portraiture joins British portraiture. The British have always liked to have portraits of their pets. And what you're looking at is the most extraordinary portrait, I think, of the 18th century in England. This is the most beautiful horse in England. His name is Whistlejacket, and he's painted by Stubbs in the 1760s. Whistlejacket was a racing horse, but he wasn't actually a very successful racehorse. He didn't win very much, but everybody thought he was the most beautiful animal they'd ever seen. And so his owner, Lord Rockingham, had him painted life-size and didn't want anything else in the portrait to distract. He, the owner, was not shown riding him. There's no groom, there's no background. And he built a room in his house in order to house this portrait. This is an animal portrait, just like the elephant, of an outstanding, great, noble animal.
So now we come to the last type of portrait that we're going to discuss today, and we thought we'd just have a little bit of fun by ending on the idea of the alternative portrait, deeply unconventional and something that brings us also a little bit into our modern and contemporary times, because we start by looking at a portrait that Picasso made of one of his girlfriends. And I hand over to you.
I think you can probably tell that the relationship between Picasso and this girlfriend was in rather a tricky state when this was made. But it does, again, say, what is a portrait for? Who is meant to look at it? What's it about? Of course, you could have taken a photograph of Dora Maar, and many people did. And of course, you could paint her looking like her. But Picasso, of course, is doing something quite else. He's talking about the whole experience of looking at a person, how you never see the whole person at once, how you see bits of a person and it keeps changing, and sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't, sometimes they're the same, but usually they're not. And if she is a completely impossible mistress who is irritated and angry because you're having an affair with a much more glamorous and younger woman, then you paint her looking like this. And he knows what he's doing, she certainly knew what he was doing, but we, I think, still get the sense that this is about the unknowability of the other person. This is really about a 20th century view of the human psyche. There's no one central stable person, and the relationship will keep changing. And that's why this is such a great image.
So Neil, when the aim of a portrait is not to capture the physical likeness, would you say that it provides an opportunity for the artist to try and capture something that is non-physical, that is more to do with the energy, the personality, the charisma of a person, when you move away from their literal likeness?
I think that's right. I think when you look at this, you know what she's going to sound like when she starts speaking, don't you? You know the tone of voice that's going to come from this. And you can imagine the level of animation in it. Exactly that. We should probably finish quite soon. Talk. Yes.
Oh. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up now with a very strange little tradition, minor tradition that came up in Turkey in the 19th century of the Prophet Muhammad. What you're looking at is a votive plaque covered with tiny bits of writing which provide a physical description of the Prophet. But instead of taking a human form, these votive plaques became a kind of a word portrait of the Prophet. It's a very minor tradition, but it's something worth putting in there just as an alternative way. And I think we're going to end with the inevitable future look from here, which is the selfie portrait.
Yes, the purpose of this whole session has been to allow you to make a better selfie. You can now decide which of these kinds of portraits you want to be. Do you want to show yourself as Parvati? Do you want to show yourself as Vladimir Putin? Do you want to see yourself as a form of words? Whatever. It's your choice. And for the first time ever, everybody can do it again and again and again. And as we all know, everybody is doing it again and again and again. And we now have a few minutes for questions, if there are questions. Are there some microphones wandering around? So if there are questions, we've got a few minutes. One question in the front row. Yes. A question, please. And then
Sir, this is a question to you. Was it common to use false portraits to enforce a message? For example, Henry IV had a larger-than-life portrait of himself after the execution of Anne. Thank you so much.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Was it common to use false portraits to enforce a message? For example, Henry VIII has a larger-than-life portrait of himself after Anne's execution.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The great thing about the portrait of the ruler before photography is that most of the subjects had never seen the ruler. They had no idea what they looked like. So you could make it as false as you liked, and bigger the better. Exactly. The man at the back with the red, sorry, the man in the with the red book behind you.
Good afternoon. My question is regarding the future of portraits. So this is one article I read last year on NPR titled "The Next Rembrandt," in which there's this guy from JWT Amsterdam who wanted to recreate Rembrandt's work. So what they did was they got in artificial intelligence that scanned through all the previous work of Rembrandt, and then created a new painting which just looked like Rembrandt's work down to the bits. So such kind of a development, what will it lead to? Will it immortalize the artist, or it will kill the art? What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know what Navina would say, but I think this is where Photoshop is terrific. As we all know, we can start off looking like Rembrandt, and with a little bit of adjustment, the lines can be removed, your hair color can be changed, you can make it exactly what you want. Every one of us in the room can. So I think the image as the portrait is now so easily manipulable by everybody that what is the new space for the painter, the new space for the photographer has got to be invented. That's why we wanted to end with the selfie, because it really does challenge completely what the portrait is, and it's a moment for the artist to reinvent. In the front row here, yes. And then over there.
Hello. Following your earlier talk on Shakespeare, I was wondering if you could expand on his famous portrait and what type of portrait that is, whether it is idealized, observed, etc.
Well, the question is about the Shakespeare portrait. Shakespeare is a very good example because, like Homer, we don't have any image that we know is of Shakespeare. But one portrait was quite early on said to be of Shakespeare. Nobody describes what Shakespeare looks like. And so on the basis of that assertion, really, the whole of our iconography of Shakespeare has developed. And everybody knows what Shakespeare looks like. You can make jokes with the image, you can play with Shakespeare's image, but it probably has nothing to do with Shakespeare at all. And I think we're all rather hoping that one day we will discover who that Chandos portrait, the first portrait, actually is of. And it's almost certainly of somebody else. But as with Homer, it doesn't really matter any longer. The great thing is we have a face that we can relate to. And into it, we will read everything we want to read, which is the point.
We have the last question here.
Yes.
You talked about the mended and forced images of ideas converted into portraits. What I wanted to ask is, wasn't there any disputes? I mean, there was a whole lot of population. They couldn't have any agreeing on the same portrait throughout. Like the Buddha one, the Jesus one. They must have had their different views, their different images of them.
Thank you. It's a very, very good question. Do people dispute what he looks like? And I can't speak about the Buddhist tradition. I don't know whether you can. But certainly in the Christian tradition, you're absolutely right. People throughout, particularly in the 17th, 18th century, talk a great deal about whether this is the right image, the one they want. They're painting without a beard, whatever. And there are a lot of debates. The big question arose really in the last 50 years about showing Christ essentially as a well-educated, well-groomed Western European. And how do you show a Christ who is from Latin America, from Africa, from China, from India, wherever? And the idea that the image of Christ had become so ethnically precise, when the teaching is not, has been a very, very big debate, and is still a very strong debate. And I think if you looked at that image in the last 50 years, you would see a sudden explosion of different images for precisely that reason. I think we're being told we have to stop.
I have a question, if I may. May I have a question? Right here on this
If you have a microphone, you have a question.
Okay, thank you. So this is a related question, actually, to the previous one, which is that, the image of the Buddha that you showed us. Now, I was in Sri Lanka recently, and the representation that comes out of his head, I think you said that it was like an extra brain. But in Sri Lanka, which is Theravada Buddhism, they described it as the flame that comes out of Buddha's head when he achieves nirvana. Now, is this because different streams of Buddhism have different representations? So what you call an extra brain is perhaps also the nirvana flame. Is it because it's different?
Well, I mean, you're talking about Buddha images over a vast territory and over many centuries. So there are many variations on what you see. I think in some cases you see what looks like a protuberance on top of the head which is covered in hair, a continuation of the pattern which is on the rest of the head, which is what makes people interpret it as both a hairstyle. I mean, that's, if you don't know at all that if you don't give it any symbolic value, it simply looks like a top knot, which is something that you see in the depiction of saints, the sculptural traditions, depictions of saints in India, where you have the hair tied in a top knot. So it's not very far from that interpretation. And then you also have an explanation, which is given in some texts of this being one of the 13 or 8 attributes of Buddhahood: the long ears, the cranial protuberance, the flame on the middle of the chest. Then again, you have to think about stylization as well, because sometimes a flame looks like a flame, sometimes it looks like something else. So it's really the kind of extraordinary language of diverse forms of stylistic expression. And the fact that, there's no clear answer. It's not a sort of direct, well, this is meant to be that. You're talking about an interface over many centuries of style, text, different techniques of carving, different materials, different contexts within which these images are produced.
Thank you. And I think that's where we have to end. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Navina, for such wonderful session. Very sorry to say this was our second last, and soon we'll be coming to the last session of our festival.